What's up, everyone? Today I wanted to walk you guys through one of my games. Now you might wonder why I want to post my games. That's because I want you guys to see my games. So over here we can see that I'm playing black and my opponent has played e4. So I reply with c5, the Sicilian defense, which looks like this. And at this point my opponent plays the move knight to c3, which is called the closed Sicilian. In the main line of the Sicilian, we usually reply with the move pawn to d6. When you face the closed Sicilian, you can reply with the main move pawn to d6, but I prefer replying in a slightly different way. So I reply with the move pawn to e6 instead. And I'm going to show you why. So my opponent plays knight to f3, and I reply with the move pawn to g6. Now, you might be thinking, what am I doing with these pawns here? So what we really want to do over here is we want to put our bishop in this diagonal. We want to put our knight here. So oftentimes when you face a closed Sicilian, people will want to push their pawn forward. And that kicks away your knight from the f6 square if you put it there. So you would rather develop it to e7. And the reason we push e6, it also helps us with the d5 thrust. So that's the setup that we want to play. Now going back to the game, my opponent replies with the move bishop to d3, while I reply with the plan that I had suggested, which is bishop to g7. Don't know what happened there. The pieces just started moving on their own. Um, then my opponent replied with the move castles. Then my opponent castled, and I played the move that I said I would, knight to e7. So this is the developing stage of the game, and my opponent pushes a pawn. Now that's not how you want to go about in the opening phase. You would rather develop some pieces so that your pieces can help you. So I develop a piece. My opponent also tries to fianchetto to his bishop, fianchetto to his bishop, so that he can oppose my dark square bishop to trade it off. And I push the d5 thrust, which is the reason we played the move pawn to e6. My opponent attacks my pawn, my c pawn, and we defend it. An exchange happens in the center, which really gives me a big center, and my opponent loses all central control. And if you are able to achieve this kind of a central setup with the Sicilian, you've already succeeded partially. My opponent puts the rook on that file so that he can push his pawn forward, b4, pawn to b4, or so that he can bring his bishop back and trade it off, as we will see in this match. So that b4 doesn't come, I put an additional protection on that particular square, and my opponent goes back so that he can trade off the bishops. Now at this point, my opponent could play this move and pin my knight with his rook. So you don't want to see that on the board, so I castle. He brings his knight back to make some kind of a knight maneuver or to push the c pawn forward, one of the two. And now instead of developing a piece, I also had the option of pushing this pawn forward, which would ideally block off the bishop's trade and the eye of the dragon, so it's called the bishop on that side, is kind of important for the defense of your king. But I didn't want to see this move on the board because that only helps my opponent attack my center using this move. So I would rather have the bishops traded off. So the bishops were traded off at this point. Both the bishops were traded off at this point, and my opponent pushed c3, probably trying to push b4, but we'll see. I bring my knight back, essentially adding extra control to all of the central squares. The central squares are all now being controlled by my knights, as you can see. Each of the knights are controlling these four squares, while the pawns also control each of the squares. Now that's too many arrows there, I know, but what can be done? So this entire line is being controlled by my minor pieces and my pawns. That really makes it difficult for my opponent to push forward. But he wants to push forward and push b4, which we are okay with. Now with this rook maneuver, we are attacking the knight. And a good trick when you're playing your opponents is to let an attack come with discovery. I could at this point double up with my queen and put additional pressure on that knight, but then my opponent could just move his rook and essentially threaten my queen because his rook would be guarded by his knight. So, so I play this move knight to e4, knight to e4, and with this move, all I'm doing is essentially shielding my attack from the rook to the knight. Oftentimes, this is a trick that you can use in your games. It helps you attack your opponent's piece, and your opponent would not notice. Because at this point, when you look at this knight, it's not really threatened by anything, but it is. The rook is x-raying it. My opponent plays the move rook to c1. I don't know why he played that move, but it was played. At this point, I doubled up, attacking that knight. We have two attackers over here on the knight, while there's only one defender. Now, all we need is a good discovery. My opponent does an exchange, which leads to a better pawn structure for me, and we are happy with that. My opponent places the queen over there, which also I don't know serves what purpose, and we are ready with our discovery. Knight takes on d2, and my opponent at this point played the move queen takes on d2, and as planned we go ahead and capture our opponent's knight. An exchange takes place here with the queen. The queens come off the board. So now my opponent attacks my pawn over here in the center of the board. Now we have a few options here. We can either go back with the knight and defend with this pawn, or we could also defend this pawn with the rook. And neither of those moves actually do much because they're both leading to a more passive position. And if you play your rook behind this pawn, your opponent can also push forward, attacking your pawn. And you don't really want to take because your pawns would be doubled here. So your entire movement gets blocked. But what you can do so that your position becomes active is you going to the attack. It is always a good idea to put your rooks in your opponent's seventh rank. So when you're black, the seventh rank for you is the second line, the second row, and when you're white, the seventh rank is the seventh row. So at this point, this pawn is of course threatened twice by both the rooks, and my opponent has to defend the pawn. But he chooses to play actively as well. He plays the move rook takes my d pawn, rook takes on d5. At this point, again, our c pawn is threatened, but we don't really want to defend that. We want to continue attacking in an active fashion. So we take the f pawn. Our opponent happily accepts another pawn too. He takes on c. He takes the c pawn. We go ahead and take the g pawn because it comes with check. Notice that our knight is threatened, but we don't always have to react to all threats. It is very important to keep in mind that the bigger threat matters more and you have to react to it first. So my opponent moves away from the check, and I know many of you are thinking of providing a further check here, but that would be a big mistake. You would blunder the game away because the knight defends that square. So at this point, our knight is hanging, so we need to do something about it. So it is always good to move with an attack instead of moving with no plan in mind, right? You need to use your knight actively in the position. How do we go about doing that? Now, you have to imagine where you want your knight to be. Where do you want the knight to be? Let's imagine If we could bring our knight magically from here without getting taken by our opponent, and from here if we could bring our knight magically here, it would be checkmate. And that is the square we want our knight to be on. So how do you make such a maneuver happen without letting your opponent notice? So now we make a move that serves two purposes at the same time. Knight to e7. What we plan to do is bring our knight here, and from there our knight can go there. And from there our knight can go there. And that would be checkmate. And knights can be very tricky pieces, and your opponents won't easily notice what your plans are with your knights if you can be subtle about it. Because to an ordinary opponent, it just looks like, oh yeah, I attacked his knight and he just moved away. I won a tempo. But not really, we are moving with a plan in mind. So my opponent goes ahead and plays this move, attacking the knight, only helping my cause. And I put my knight where we wanted to put it. At this point, there's no way from stopping this knight going into the square where we want it to go other than giving up the rook, which is what my opponent does. So, and we happily accept this exchange sacrifice. It only makes our life easier. Uh, then my opponent plants his knight here. And now if you notice, this square is accessible to us. We no longer have to worry about going there because the knight was previously defending it. Now it's not. So I go ahead and apply this check. My opponent plays the move king there, which is the only move there. Now in this position, you have a few choices. You can go after more material, or you can simplify the game. And it's always better to simplify the game when you're in a completely winning position. So we go ahead and further check the king to get it into a position where we want it to be. Now the king has only one move, which is this square. And how do you simplify a position like this? Ideally, you want to trade the rooks off. That way, it becomes a very easily winnable endgame when it's rook versus knight. So this is what I came up with. I gave this check, which leaves the king no option but to take my rook, which he does. And the next move that I play is taking the opponent's rook, which also comes with the attack on the knight. Now notice, in this position, no matter where the knight goes, it takes the knight more than two moves to defend this particular pawn, which is a passed pawn. And you must always be careful with passed pawns. It is a very good idea to put a rook behind a passed pawn. So when the knight is attacked, it will take it at least three moves to defend that pawn. And that gives us enough time to pick it up because it only takes us two moves to pick up the pawn. So my opponent moves his knight with an attack on the rook, and we go behind the passed pawn. Don't go beside it because that won't lead to anything good. That pawn can simply be pushed, and then the knight may be able to fork you or defend the pawn somehow. So you don't want to do such a thing. You want to go behind the pawn, right? And the game continues. My opponent at this point gets a bit fed up and just sacrifices his knight for some reason. And here onwards is just an easy conversion where there's just an endgame that there is absolutely no issue converting. An easy ladder mate is what we are going to get in this position. So at this point, I play the move pawn to pawn queening and make a queen. Oh no, the match is suddenly a draw now. But that's what we are thinking, right? That's not what you want to do. You always have to check in positions like these whether bringing a queen in leads to a stalemate or not. It's very important to remember that working so hard to get a winning position, you don't want to throw it away with a stalemate. So we promote to a rook, leaving our opponent only one option, which is to bring his king here. And then checkmate was delivered. Well, that's it for today, guys. Hope to see you soon in another one of my videos. Bye bye, take care.